I'm James Wise, a partner at Balderson Capital, and welcome to What's Next, an interview series with people working at the cutting edge of new technology. Today we're talking to Jonno Evans. He's a former diplomat, advisor to 2 prime ministers, and now advises and invests in deep technology companies. In this episode, we discuss Jonno's experience of working on policy with government, how government's preparing itself for decades to come of huge technological change, and what he looks for when investing in deep tech founders. Jonno, welcome to the What's Next podcast. Thank you very much for coming along. So the point behind this interview series is really to focus on people building hard tech businesses and hopefully inspire a few more people to take on those challenges. And today you're helping people do that as an investor. Perhaps before we go into what you do in your day-to-day today, perhaps we can talk a little bit about how you got here. Like, how did you end up working with deep tech companies and where did you come from?
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. I've taken definitely a non-traditional path into venture, I think it'd be fair to say. I started my career in government, spent most of the early part there, both initially as a diplomat, so spent some time overseas in the US, in part following the Trump election cycle, which was sort of slightly mad, but also thinking a lot about economic policy and the startup scene on the West Coast and getting into the whole world of startups, which was sort of super interesting. Then got dragged back like every other British civil servant to think about Brexit for my sins. So spent the next few years thinking a lot about Brexit, negotiating our divorce agreement with the European Commission, and then ended up in Downing Street. So I spent a number of years in Downing Street as a foreign policy advisor, private secretary to 2 prime ministers. And that was interesting in part because what it exposed is, if you care about foreign policy and geopolitics, which was what I was thinking a lot about, you actually care about technology. Those 2 things are in effect synonymous now, whether it's semiconductors and what's going on in China and Taiwan, or whether it's decarbonization and climate change and net zero. That's really a technology story about how we adopt those sorts of technologies, right through to defense tech and AI and how we're leveraging some of those novel technologies in that domain too, right, sort of at the cutting edge and at the coalface of sort of hard power, I guess. And so through that journey, it became very clear that, technology was an incredibly important driving force in the global economy. And if you care about technology and geopolitics, the best place to be was trying to support some of these companies to both become established and grow. So one thing led to another, ended up escaping government, doing some other early stage investing and some consulting, but fundamentally wanted to come back to what we call sort of deep tech now, which is, investing in hard technologies that are, leveraging breakthroughs in science and technology to build products that have an impact on the world. And that impact can be in any one of those areas I mentioned and many more too. So, for me, deep tech is, a really important part of the global economy and, what is going to drive kind of resilience in the West as well over time. So for all sorts of reasons, it's a fascinating.
Yeah. And I think, once again, one of the reasons why we're doing this interview series is because we fundamentally believe if you want to have an impact at a global scale, you can do that in many ways, but increasingly it's clear that working on hard tech problems is becoming a more and more important way that you can have that kind of impact. So before diving into sort of the kind of companies you're working with today, maybe we can dial back to that role in central government. Government gets a lot of criticism for its ability to work with large technology companies and small startups and provide the infrastructure around building those businesses. Do you think that criticism is fair? And in your experience and sort of from things that you've done, does government get fair rap?
Well, it's difficult. I think there are some things that the government does pretty well. There's an assortment of different programs that have been set up in different bits of government, whether it's NHS X, thinking about how do you digitize bits of the healthcare system, or J-Hub, or DASA or DSTL in defense domain, or even NSIF, national security.
Do you want to talk about a little bit more about some of the things like J-Hub?
Yeah, so these are in effect programs to try and understand what technology is out there and how it can be applied to users on the front line. So the J-Hub is an interesting example in the MOD, grabbing bits of technology, putting it in users' hands and saying, look, how useful is this to you and can we roll it out across different bits of the forces? Okay, really, really interesting model. And so I think government does quite a good job of understanding different bits of innovation, funding bits of innovation, The challenge we then have is how do you roll that out across government? How do you adopt it more broadly across some of these really, really big institutions and organizations? And that's just hard, right? And there are certain very, very logical reasons why government is a little bit tentative about, putting startups into very multi-year projects, for instance. If you're a procurement officer in the MOD, it's pretty rational to think you don't want to stick a 10-year contract to build a really important bit of capability and give that to a startup because, are they going to be around in 12, 18 months? Do they have the balance sheet to do that? But then it gets a bit chicken and egg. And, at some point, government has to invest in some of these technology companies, give them sufficiently big contracts that they can actually go and build the technology and deliver and then become incorporated into a wider ecosystem. So it's a kind of tricky balance. I think, there's an interesting example just this week, actually, in the US where the US Air Force has sort of given a pretty chunky contract to Anduril to develop a new autonomous system. And, that's an example of a technology company that, it's been going a while now and it's certainly not small, but it's taken them a good while to prove that they can deliver and are now just starting to win some of those bigger contracts.
I mean, and I guess it feels, from an investor and entrepreneurial perspective, working with government is very difficult. And this is one of the reasons, procurement, as you mentioned. And that's because, as you say, government doesn't necessarily want to work with businesses which don't have a huge amount of trading history or history of execution. But at the same time, if you believe now that we're at an exponential rate of improvement in certain new technologies, that means the companies starting today are going to be outpacing the ones which are decades old and unable to innovate pretty quickly. So I think back to sort of the SpaceX deal that NASA signed, probably 2008 or something like that. SpaceX hadn't existed 5 years by then, but they provided a business plan looking into the future. Whereas I guess in the UK in particular, and in other areas of the US as well, many governments, they're looking for 20-year trading history before they really engage with you, even in defense. Do you think there's a way that we can shift that attitude? And do you see things improving in that regard?
Look, I think government definitely recognises that, as you described, the sort of exponential pace of change is real, and you have to engage with the startup world. You have to engage with new technologies. You have to think about ways to bring those and adopt those technologies both within government and beyond. Do I think there's going to be some radical shake-up immediately? No, not really, if I'm honest. I don't see any particular driver for that right now within the government machine. I think, one of the things we can look at is where different policy interventions have had an impact and, can we draw lessons from that? And a bit like the NASA example, really, what are equivalent examples of that we can perhaps replicate? I think one of the interesting ones is some of the sort of advanced market commitments that have been made around renewables. Now, that's not quite the government buying the final product, but it is about creating the incentive structure, doing some, in this case, in effect, you fix a price in the future for renewable energy, and you guarantee that that's the market price at that point, and the government picks up the buffer. Now, in that example, what ended up happening after that was introduced in about 2014 was, you had a huge amount of investment into these renewable technologies, including solar, and that investment then led to the technology improving. Suddenly, actually, solar is now incredibly cost competitive and it's cheaper than gas. Okay, amazing. So you can have an impact through government policy, even if you're not necessarily going to be the ones buying the final products. Now, in defence and health, clearly the government is a big buyer there and could be the buyer of first resort, is the term that people tend to use. But in other examples, it's much more about, can you get the policy environment right? Can you put the business conditions and get the environment right, whether that's on talent and visas or whether it's on, frankly, the wider regulatory environment? Some of that is just as important for startups as anything else. In fact, while we're on the sort of regulatory piece, it's interesting, and a shout out to another venture fund, Form Ventures, who've done some really, really interesting work recently about a campaign to sort of fix the regulators. The argument isn't that we need less regulation, it's that we need to allow the regulators to do their job, actually. And nobody's arguing for no regulation, but what we might want to do is, where there are novel technologies, have the government or give the government sufficient capacity to actually for those processes to continue in a rapid enough time frame that it works for startups. So whether that's in novel foods, which is the case study that's often given out, where the UK is just fantastically slow at providing permissions, and that's killing startups. So there's a lot the government can do. Some of it's about buying, and some of it's about creating the environment that is going to enable these startups to flourish.
And I think you're completely right. There's a capacity constraint, as in you need to fund these things properly, and there's lots of demands on government money, and rightly so. And people will say, well, health and education should come before spaceports, and I think that's a fair perspective sometimes. And then there's just specific institutional setups as well, and some institutions I think are better set up for this environment than others. I think there's also perhaps sometimes a cultural challenge as well, and having people who are used to buying proven technologies which have got long data sets around their commercial viability as well as the impact they're having, versus people who are able to be more speculative, able as in given the permission to be more speculative by their institutions, and think, right, well, we can take a risk on 3 or 4 different types of technology. Should we be looking at vertical takeoff drones, or should we be looking at horizontal takeoff spaceships when we think about long distance infrastructure for space travel, for example? The reality is you need to take some risk. No one knows the answer to those types of questions yet. And I do wonder whether or not the government has the capacity to take those risks in terms of the skill sets they can attract and allow people to operate in, rather than just the institutional and financial backing that those kind of projects need. And maybe, you're right, aspects of it working in different countries where certain institutions, maybe it's quangos like NASA, are allowed to make those bets now, which they weren't allowed to make in the past. And every country, I guess, is challenged with this at the moment.
Yeah, no question. And I completely agree on the culture point that there's no question, the incentives you're given in government are to manage downside risk, not maximize upside risk, right? The whole structure and institutions are set up to do that. We don't reward risk taking, and we don't reward failure. And if you do that, of course, you're going to end up with the outcomes that we have. So there's definitely a cultural component to it. I think there is some examples where we've made some progress on this. COVID's an interesting example. People will often cite the COVID task force and bringing in Kate Bingham from venture capital to say, look, we are going to take some bets. We're going to put some bets out from government, and we're going to gamble, and we're going to roll the dice, and we're going to invest in some of these vaccines, and some of them will work and some of them won't, and that will be fine. And that's the right thing to do in that example. So we start to have some case studies of that working. I think ARI is another interesting example. The Advanced Research Innovation Agency that's just getting going, and that's very much more on the research side, but government's ability to give an arm's length body, a chunky amount of money, 800 odd million, which for the UK isn't tiny, and say, look, go and make some bets, go and decide what are the most interesting bits of research and to go and invest in, and give scientists and researchers proper money to go and do that research, and let's see what comes of it. Maybe nothing does, but if we can make really interesting breakthroughs in the future of computing or robotics or wherever else, of the 8 opportunity spaces that the guys have created, that could have a profound impact on society. So, yeah. I think that's really powerful.
I think it's great, and the momentum certainly in the UK feels very positive at the moment. However, both those organisations, I'd also cite things like the UK Biobank, the COVID vaccine task force, as well as ARI, and things like the UK Biobank, and many other examples like that. They all seem to be institutions which were set up outside of existing central government and the broader civil service and the broader departmental setup we have today. Do you think there's just a challenge of shifting the workload of such massive organizations, which means that we need these external institutions to make a difference, rather than, for example, trying to force it through from the center downwards within the existing structures?
There's no question it can be easier to start new institutions than reform old ones, but we're never going to reform or we're never going to replace everything we have. So in some sense, you can't just argue for that, because it's never going to happen. You also have to take on the reform agenda. COVID task force actually was in the Cabinet Office, right? This was a very central department between Number 10 and the Treasury, leading all the work on COVID. So you can do it. I think, the way government tends to operate is respond to crises, right? So don't waste a good crisis, as is always said, is definitely true. And in response to big challenging moments, can you put in place the right structures, get the right incentives in place, and allow people to move fast and break things and test things out? So, you can do it, but you definitely have to seize the moment, figure out what the missions are going to be. And it's interesting that assuming we have an incoming Labour government, has defined some missions. I think that's probably a good thing. They may have too many at this point and too many challenges, but if you can be really concrete about what you're trying to do and say the whole of government machinery needs to get behind these ideas, let's create the incentive structure to allow that to happen and give people the freedom to go and try some things, then who knows, you can get good results. But it's not guaranteed, and it's hard, right? I mean, government is hard, it turns out.
Yeah. And do you think that the increased focus on sort of in particular working with new technologies and deep tech, and we've seen whether it's the AI Safety Summit or setting up of ARIA, whatever it's been recently, which has been really driven centrally and by politicians and leaders, obviously Prime Minister in particular, Sunak's led on some of these initiatives because he clearly is interested personally on these technologies' impact. Do you think that is translating through to a broader interest and either excitement or concern amongst general voters? Because I guess one of the other challenges of being in government is, yes, of course you want to steward the country appropriately, but you want to do it in a democratic way which brings people along with you, and ultimately you want to win elections through it. Do you think it makes a difference to how people might vote?
Tough question. I think the proof will be in the pudding. We'll see whether it shows up in how voters respond. I mean, fundamentally, people care about the things that affect their lives, and I think for some, issues like AI probably still feel a little bit ephemeral. It's interesting, it's tech out there, but is it really impacting my life relative to public service reform? The NHS is broken, I can't get an appointment with my GP, and or the education system feels a little bit, underfunded or whatever. And, where would you rather put your marginal pound? So do those things matter? Yes, 100%. Do they cut through to voters? Sometimes. I think the one that stands out amongst all of this is probably climate change and getting to net zero at the moment. I think we definitely have seen a public, a swell of kind of emotion and feeling about the importance of the climate, and a willingness to, invest public money in trying to adopt new technologies in that respect. And that's definitely an area I'm sure we'll see. And the Labour Party's said a lot about that, and so I'm sure we'll see more investment in that space too.
Yeah, and I think that piece of the narrative, and net zero is one, right? It's not just about net zero is good for the planet. It's also, you hope some of these new technologies will make energy cheaper, more reliable, improves our national security. So I think there's a broad narrative as to why people, do care about these things and should care about these things, about innovation in energy and the grid. I think we need more of that narrative when it comes to, what impact could AI have that's actually beneficial to people at the end of the day, right? That, my food and groceries are going to be cheaper and delivered more effectively, or I'm going to be able to get, better healthcare quicker. Those are the kind of things which I think are the natural outcomes of really successful deep tech innovation and AI innovation. And any way we can connect the innovation that's happening at the coalface, as it were, through to individuals on a day-to-day level, I think is really important. And perhaps there's still a bit of that narrative missing. We'll see, as you say, in the months to come, if the government's welcome efforts in this space are rewarded or not at the ballot box.
It's a good point. And just to jump in, I mean, the AI example is a fascinating one, right? I mean, government finds it much, much easier to prevent things happening and stop things happening rather than sort of make things happen, as it were. And, the AI Safety Summit is a kind of case in point in some sense. You have, a huge amount of interest and focus on the sort of risk end of AI and safety and existential risk and so on. And that's fine. That's very sensible. These are powerful models we need to understand and evaluate before they go out into the world. But it would have been interesting to know what the equivalent impact of a kind of national effort to adopt automation and AI would have been, right? If we had focused on that, what would the impact, as you say, be on different industries, and how would that filter through into the
I advocated very strongly at the time to call it the AI Success Summit. And it fell on deaf ears.
But interestingly, that's where the French are going, right? So when they host their summit, it won't be the AI Safety Summit, it will just be the AI Summit, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's right to identify the risks. We absolutely have to, right? And as you say, part of the big role government has to play here and the regulators have to play here is keeping people secure and safe, right? That's got to be priority number one. But if we don't get that argument through, not just to voters and end users, obviously that's important, but also to the civil servants and the frontline workers who are going to be adopting these tools, hopefully, and using them for people's benefit. If we say to them, look, actually, don't use these things, they're dangerous, we need to regulate them rather than experiment, try, learn. We will, I think, as a nation, and any nation that doesn't embrace this stuff, will see a real loss of potential productivity gains. And productivity gains is ultimately a kind of clumsy way of saying benefits to people. So I'm sort of very focused on how we get that narrative across to people in general. More specifically, during your time in government and now on the other side of the table, I guess, as an investor and advisor, how should entrepreneurs who are looking to work with government, whether that's working at the very the state-of-the-art technologies that may need government funding or government infrastructure to succeed, or the ones which are scaling and now want to procure and sell to government. How should they interact with government? And have you seen good examples of entrepreneurs working well with the state?
Yeah, it's notoriously difficult, and most companies find it tough to get through the door. The thing that I've seen work best is just, and it's just in some sense a boring comment, but building sort of relationships with stakeholders, right, and building trust and building credibility. And that doesn't come overnight. That doesn't come from showing up and saying, why aren't you adopting my shiny bit of tech? It's over a number of years, building a relationship with a whole range of stakeholders in a field, whether that's in defence or health or frankly anywhere else, and saying,
I'm going to kind of stop you there. Who are the right stakeholders though? Because I think, if you look at this and really drill down into it, like, is it reaching out to your local MP? Is it meeting ministers? Is it meeting civil servants? Is it meeting SPADs?
Well, all of the above. There's a sort of top down and bottom approach that you'll have inevitably in this space. Some of it is about getting ministerial interest. What's the impact that this particular bit of technology could have on the system or on government in general? The approach that, say, a Palantir took to trying to bring their technology into and become the sort of operating system of government is one approach that was very much top down. The other is to say, look, we've got to get users using the tool. And if you have enough of a groundswell of people in, say, the armed forces who say we can't live without this bit of technology, whether it's a sensor or whether it's a bit of comms kit or whatever else, and that filters up. And then you've got to hit the buyer, like who's the buyer, who owns the budget, and you've got to reach them too, because ultimately it is rarely ministers who sign off spending decisions. They do it at the macro level, but not one stage below that. So you kind of got to hit every part of that. And the companies that are successful have a plan to do that. They know the right folk and they've invested in it, right? Selling to government is hard. You've got to invest in doing it.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. So in my role on the Industrial Development Advisory Board, which is an advisory board for government on certain areas of investment in infrastructure and deep tech companies, it's amazing how often a ministerial announcement actually gets made before the full budget's there and everyone's agreed with it. Can you believe it? But as a result, it really does speed up the due diligence process, and you really pay a lot more attention. So I think that ministerial relationships can help as well, clearly. And it's a tricky one to navigate because you want to have a transparent and democratic process, but you also, and I think have welcomed over the last few years, ministers who really are leaning in and want to learn and engage with new technologies. I think that's an important part of the job, especially if the way of implementing it is with a civil service, which perhaps doesn't naturally lean that way.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's hard to argue with. The more we can get ministers engaged in understanding, the potential power of different technologies, what impact that can have in society, and have them excited by it, right? Are they willing to go and sell what might be additional costs to the taxpayer in order to leverage some of this technology? Are they willing to do that or not? Do they really understand the issues or not? I mean, the only thing I'd push back on is the civil service really that way inclined? I think a lot of it actually would be desperate to use a lot more of this technology, would be desperate to bring and adopt more of it and use it in their work, but also roll it out across public services. I think there's huge demand to do it. It's just quite difficult, as we talked about, for structural reasons.
Yeah, and the civil service gets some criticism, but then it's also difficult for General Electric or some of the biggest companies in the world. Getting behavioural change is hard, and thinking about how to do that at scale, I think, is one of the most important challenges in management today, let alone in government policy. And have you found in your new role as a sort of deep tech investor and advisor, have you found yourself drawing on those skills of providing policy advice to ministers and prime ministers and providing diplomatic expertise to foreign policy officials? Have you found that useful? Do you draw on that regularly when you're thinking about the investments you make and the support you provide?
I mean, it's a sort of generalizable skill set, I guess, and all of those skills are useful in different contexts. I think thinking through different sorts of problem sets and figuring out, in a first principles way, what are the different technologies out there? Why do they matter? What impact are they going to have? Who's going to buy them? What are the problems different stakeholders really have? And, can you draw that together in a compelling thesis and think through, to what extent are these companies going to be groundbreaking and generational companies is sort of part one. Part two, as you know, having invested, a big part of the job is helping companies go and build big companies or build and sell their products to a whole range of different stakeholders. Some of that's about your network and can you open doors. Some of it's about Can you make good strategic decisions? And I'm pretty new into this, so I shouldn't say too much about it. But hopefully my skill set will help some of those companies make good decisions over time.
Beyond your experience in policy, then, what are you currently looking at in terms of the frontiers of technology that you think are going to be so revolutionary over the next decade it's worth investing capital into?
Yeah, and this is in some sense where it gets exciting, right? Because the map is just a complete green space. There's just so many exciting things happening right now. I mean, IQ Capital, the fund that I work for, we're an early stage deep tech fund, so we invest, very early stage, pre-seed to Series A, in a whole range of different deep tech sectors, whether that's on the hardware side, semiconductor space, quantum and what have you, through to things that are software focused, whether it's AI, ML, or data infrastructure or cybersecurity. And we have a life sciences practice too. So really broad suite of different kinds of technologies that we think about. And we sort of call ourselves a generalist deep tech fund. And part of the reason for that is because often the most exciting and interesting ideas, as I see it at least, come from the kind of combination of different disciplines. And when some of these new breakthroughs collide with each other, the sort of classic Matt Ridley slogan of ideas having sex, that's the kind of it happens all the time. And when it does, it's incredibly exciting. We've got a company in the portfolio I'm working with at the moment called Mitos. They're automating stem cell production. Now, on the surface of it, that's a life sciences company, but yes, it requires a huge, sophisticated understanding of biotech and that side of the house, bioreactors. Plus, it's really a robot, right? I mean, this is about machinery and how do you devise a machine that can replicate what's to date been a very human process and a manual process of developing and producing stem cells, with a software layer on top that allows you to run some really interesting analytics and AI across it. So that kind of company you may think of as a life science company, but really that's drawing together a whole bunch of different technologies in different ways. And there are, a whole range of different interesting breakthroughs all the time, and you never know quite where they're going to come from. But you can think about advances in compute over the last 10 or 15 years and the ability to do that at the edge. You can think about, incredible advances in sensors and sensing. Another portfolio company of ours is called Paragraph, and that's a graphene-based company, and they're doing some incredible things around biosensing, sticking molecules on a chip and allowing you to sense different kinds of different things in incredibly granular ways. A whole load of things in sort of digital simulation, and how can we represent the physical world digitally and run simulations against that, through to AI and the modeling that we can do in a whole range of different sectors, not just in language, but apply some of these models to robotics or to materials or bio. Incredibly exciting stuff. And the combination of some of those things into different companies is been incredibly exciting for me to see, and I think some of those will go on to becoming really important businesses, or I hope they will.
Where we normally invest at Balderson is slightly later stage, so we're looking at tractable technical problems, but obviously then looking at, okay, how do they develop a product around it? How do you think about commercialization? How do you build a team, and how do you scale? When you're investing at the earlier stages as you do, how do you de-risk the technical decisions you're making? Because just in that breadth of different sectors you mentioned there's still some fundamental technical breakthroughs that need to happen in order for some of those products to be able to work. So how do you go about assessing an investment opportunity in one of these, as it were, 0 to 1 style technical companies?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of it is the team. We're very, very lucky at IQ to have a really technical team that has. Many of the team have PhDs in very impressive bits of tech, whether it's in materials or quantum or bio, and so that allows us to do a whole chunk of due diligence internally. What I would say is we don't sort of take science risks. These aren't science projects we're investing in. These are companies that have proven technology that works, and have got over the hurdle of saying, does the thing work or not, and is then about how do you build a product around that technology. And so we talk about, we don't take sort of science and tech risk in one sense. We might take some market risk. It might be about an engineering problem that if you can go from having an initial prototype, can you engineer that to be produced at scale? And so that's the risk we're more willing to take, as opposed to, can you get the thing to work at all? And that's a bit earlier than where we would come in. That's what you would expect to find still in perhaps academia or in a research lab and so on.
And that was my natural next step is, so is most of the science risk being taken in academia? And is that still the way that most of people who start deep tech or hard tech companies, as it were, are coming to you? Or are you seeing people spinning out of research labs and big corporates, or individuals who are sort of self-taught or experimenting in other businesses?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I mean, I think traditionally in Europe, the vast majority of deep tech companies have been academic spin-outs, and that's great, and we definitely want to see more of that. But increasingly, there's the corporate labs are an important player too. Whether it's some of the research going on at DeepMind in robotics, for instance, is some phenomenal research going on there, and I'm sure we'll see spin-outs of that space. And going back to AI, there's no question that some of these academic labs don't always have the funding and the compute requirements in that capacity to do the level of research that can happen, in corporate labs. So it's definitely a balance. The one thing I would say is there's a kind of interesting cultural dynamic in the UK around spin-outs in particular. And one of the things that we're increasingly thinking about is how can we push our founders to think more about the really specific problem that they're solving with their technology, or that, as a result of the breakthroughs that they've created. I think in the States, a lot more what you find is entrepreneurs go out, find a corporate problem or a really, an issue that is incredibly intractable, and customers would be willing to pay significant sums if they could only fix it, and then go and find academics and researchers to go and solve that problem. I think in general in Europe, we go the other way, and we produce these beautiful bits of technology and then go and try and find a problem. And I think we could learn some lessons from the US in that respect.
And do you think if you were doing the same job, investing at the same stage in the US, you see a much higher mix of people spinning out of research labs and sort of non-academic settings versus academic settings?
Yeah, and I think so. And I think you'd find many more people who are in industry also, and who say, look, I've found a problem and I'm going to go and fix it. And I might not be the best technologist to do that. It may not be me that's, spent the last 15 years in academia or research figuring out how to solve the problem, but I'm going to go and find the right people, pull together a team and produce the thing and create the product and sell it. And so it's a kind of different approach to how we think about entrepreneurship, I think, often between over there and here.
Yeah, I see it in Israel as well, by the way. I see sort of ecosystems of people being built and really driven by an individual who said, I've seen this problem in the corporate world. I'm going to go and find that person, whether it's in academia or it's in defense or another company, and build things that way. It does feel like a lot of the teams that we see, also phenomenal businesses, develop organically. And you can do that if you're in a phenomenal institution like Imperial or Cambridge or Oxford or Manchester. And, we've got many great universities where you're surrounded by other experts, so it can happen. But I think we'd see a lot more deep tech businesses founded if more of that cultural attitude towards working together cross-discipline and out of research and out of corporates happened here. And in terms of the way that you assess people, so obviously you said you're an early stage investor, the team is the most important thing. How do you do that today? Is this a formula which you can follow? Is there a benchmark? Do you bring certain mental models to it? Or do you normally find it's actually quite organic, the kind of assessments you make of people when investing?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, because I mean, there's no question the team is just fundamentally important to doing this. Can the team, do they have the technical chops? Do they have the ability to go and build a really big business? It takes a certain kind of person to both want to go and do this and to be able to pull it off. And that's partly about, do you have the technical capabilities? It's partly about, can you go and tell a story, and can you sell a vision? Can you hire the right people? Can you go and raise the capital that's going to allow you to do it? And some of it is about, do you really have the kind of particular grit and persistence and ability to keep going when it gets tough? And so, it's never one thing. It's a combination of, do you think the individual or individuals in question can bring together that quite rare combination of skills that's both technical and commercial and narrative and persistence and grit? And, do those kinds of characteristics come together in one person? And the truth is, pretty rarely, right? I mean, it's, and to add one more thing is, in some sense, why is this specific person the right person to do it? Do they have a particularly unique insight into this problem, whether it's because they've worked in it already and they know it inside out, or they've got a specific bit of technical?
Yeah. I mean, I think the founder fit problem is much greater when you're looking at deeply technical problems, partly because obviously the areas of expertise are so niche that having experience in it does help. And secondly, because working in hard tech problems versus, let's say, a more traditional software application development, the feedback cycles are so much longer in almost every discipline, right? Whether you're doing a clinical trial or you're doing something in material sciences or you're shipping a hardware product, the feedback cycles that you're working on can be weeks, months, or years and longer. And so that additional stress of not knowing which direction your product's going in and the persistence and patience you need as a founder is markedly higher than if you're working in a software application where hopefully you're getting feedback on a very regular basis. Even if you're doing something in open source and AI, you're getting more feedback on a regular basis. When you're training models, you're seeing benchmarks and feedback than you would be if you were building a hardware product. When you think about the types of businesses that you want to work with, do you get enough businesses coming to you which really have the level of ambition at a global scale, you think, to drive returns in deep tech? Because it's been one of the criticisms of sort of Europe as a whole and even the UK, which has a relatively strong entrepreneurial network, that a lot of people don't scale the businesses as big as they could be, and we get companies bought up too early, often by US companies who go on to really commercialize the hard scientific work that's been slogged through here in the UK.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I must say, I've been incredibly impressed by the level of vision I've seen and the kind of commitment to building big companies since coming into this space. I guess the narrative has often been, Europeans, they sell out early and they don't really want to do it. I think I think it's changed, or it's changing if not already. And to take just a couple of examples from our portfolio at the moment, we have a company called Niobolt. They produce rapid charging batteries. So it's lithium-ion batteries, and they're, for EVs, these charge in about 6 minutes. That's a completely groundbreaking bit of technology that's going to change the EV market and the logistics around it and the infrastructure that's required. And they are already a sizable company, and they're going to go on, I suspect, to be a very, very big company. Originally spun out of Cambridge from the academic lab there, and I have no doubt about the ability of the founders there to go on and build a really big business. Across the portfolio that we have, there's, of course, some companies will become bigger and more successful than others, but it's pretty rare not to hear the story of guys saying, look, and girls saying, look, we want to go and build a really big business, and we think we can do so in a way that's globally significant. And that's what, ultimately that's what we're looking for. So, I think would I like to see more sort of moonshots, maybe, as maybe you want to put it? And of course it would be fun to see more. It'd be nice to fund more of those as well, the really, really big ideas. And I think there's lots of them around. I was just having a conversation this morning about advanced manufacturing and, what's the next big idea there? And is it really just automating what we do now? Or is it, how do we leapfrog the Chinese, and how do we actually design and make things in completely different ways? That's a totally different way of thinking. How do you build the next generation of factories that don't look anything like what they look like today? And these are the kinds of ideas that people are having. These are the kind of businesses people are coming to us saying, look, would you fund it? Does it make sense? What's the business model? Can we get the right people? Where would you do it? And those are fascinating conversations to have. And, I have no doubt that the next generation of founders have huge ambition and are going to go on to build, fantastically big, important companies.
Is there enough capital for those kind of businesses to be built in the UK?
Well, I think there's definitely enough capital for them to get started, and I think we would always like to have more. I think it would be fair to say. I mean, if you look relative to the US, there's it's a fraction of the amount of capital going into European deep tech venture capital relative to the US. The obvious implication of that is that round sizes can be slightly smaller, and the corollary is, does that really give some of these companies enough capital and resource to go on to build the big companies? I think that's improving, and we have seen a big influx of capital into deep tech over the last few years, which is great. And that's a recognition that actually some of the structural factors around deep tech, some of the moats that you can build, and the defensibility of some of this technology does mean and is attractive. And some of the traditional tropes around high capex costs and being unattractive, it isn't so much the case anymore. And some of those capex costs actually look a bit more like opex now, if you're thinking about clouds rather than servers, and code-based experiments rather than lab-based experiments, and exercises being digitally run in simulations rather than humans running them. All of those things actually allow you to do much more with much less capital, and it's making a number of deep tech companies look more capital efficient. So that helps. The next question is then sort of later stage funding, and is there enough later stage funding? I think once you get to that stage, and you would know this much better than I, but growth stage funding is a global market, right? And that, whereas early stage stuff is a bit more geographically constrained. Series B, C, D, and so on, that is a global market, and it's a global competition for that capital, and generally the best companies get funded. The challenge, I think, in that part of the market is whether growth stage investors have spent enough time thinking about deep tech companies and the nuances of deep tech companies. So, interesting question for you in some sense. When you're looking at software company X and deep tech company Y, of which you invest in both, they have very, very different sorts of characteristics and metrics. And the software company with X revenue and is growth Y and lots of customers, and you can measuring that against the deep tech company that's still building out its manufacturing facility, maybe doesn't have any revenue at all, but could be a huge business if it was funded because of the dynamics of that business. And I think that's where some of the challenges come here is as the ecosystem develops, as it evolves, as more people like you spend more time thinking about deep tech, we have more capital coming in that's sort of smart capital that understands what this means and how to fund it in the right way.
I think inevitably, because of the lower amount of information that you can take from hard tech companies versus traditional software application businesses, we make decisions on less potential data points around product market fit. We make the same assessment, obviously, of the founder. To offset that, what you have to believe is that the ultimate size of the market, the ultimate impact that this business could have and the value it could create is much larger, right? And it does mean that, okay, maybe we wouldn't invest in a company doing a specific molecule, for example, but we would invest in a new software layer which has deep integration into a wet lab, building a platform to develop lots of molecules. And actually, we have invested in the company in that space. And so it just shifts the balance a little bit towards businesses which really are looking for global impact. And I think that they're few and far between, those great ideas, those huge breakthroughs, and the teams that can deliver on them. Naturally, there's fewer of them. But obviously, we're just as motivated to find them, and with the right prepared mind and obviously support of interesting seed investors and experts like yourself, I think funds like Balderson are increasingly investing in that space. We always have done a bit. We always have taken risk in some of those types of businesses, but I think we're increasing the levels of risk we're willing to take in order to hit that global scale.
Yeah. And just one reflection on that. I mean, it's interesting if you look at the public markets, how many of the major companies have a hardware and a deep tech component, right? People think of the big fan companies as being software companies. They're not, right? These are all companies with huge data centers, with huge compute requirements, with huge businesses that span software and hardware, whether it's a NVIDIA on the GPU side, or whether it's Amazon with the logistics, or Meta with the whole sort of metaverse and AR play and so on. All of these companies have big deep tech hardware components, and that is a core part of their moat. And I think people are realizing that.
Yeah, and the question is, can you raise the capital and get to the proof points early enough to be able to build those moats and say, actually, supply chain, or whether it's your supply chain or it's the ownership of a particular product or it's the IP within what you're building, you've got all of those things in place to guarantee a moat early enough to maintain it and scale, rather than either get replicated by one of the players you've mentioned or get bought. And I think that is becoming not easier in terms of the complexity of it, but it's becoming easier in terms of the ability to raise capital to do that kind of thing, because investors are more prepared. They're looking for outcomes of that scale. And hopefully new technologies in the software layer are making it slightly less expensive to build some of those hard moats as well. Final question for you is, you've worked at the heart of government during some of the really toughest times in recent memory, whether it's Brexit or COVID, and now you're working on very hard tech problems in venture. You're still optimistic about the next decade or two facing not just the UK, but humanity as a whole?
Big question, James, to finish on. Yeah, of course. There's a huge amount to be optimistic about. I mean, it's hard not to be in tech and be in deep tech without basically seeing people building incredible things all the time that are going to shape the future in a really positive way. I look across our portfolio and I look across all the companies that are coming to pitch to us all the time, and they're amazingly driven, they're mission driven, they want to build products and services that are going to have a material impact on the world and solve really big problems. As I said, from decarbonisation to reindustrialisation to global resilience and national security through to longevity. I mean, these are really big problems that engaged, enthusiastic young people are going out and building companies around. I mean, if that doesn't make you optimistic and sort of enthusiastic, then I'm not sure what will.
Good. Well, I hope more of that enthusiasm and optimism filters through to the people listening to this interview as well. Jonno, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks, man.